Albuquerque, New Mexico, known for its sprawling deserts, the hum of Route 66, and the shadow of the Sandia Mountains, holds a dark secret. Beneath the dry, cracked earth of the West Mesa, horror was hidden for years. Between 2003 and 2005, women started vanishing quietly, without headlines or public alarm. The city was unaware that it was the hunting ground for a methodical killer. The desert winds covered the evidence, and silence protected the predator. It wasn't until 2009 that fate, guided by a dog and its curious owner, unearthed one of the most disturbing burial sites in American history. 11 women and 1 unborn child, buried in shallow graves, stripped of identity, of dignity, of justice. The media would dub the killer the West Mesa Bone Collector, but behind the name lies a tragedy that reflects deep societal failures, the vulnerability of forgotten communities, and a killer who still walks free. The dusty surface of the desert had become a cemetery that spoke no words, but under that silence was a web of tragedy that the city had long refused to see. It's a case not only about a serial killer, but about what happens when society turns its back on its most vulnerable. This story forces us to question what justice means when it's delayed, what worth we place on certain lives, and how much horror can hide beneath the surface of everyday places. Chapter 1: The Bone That Broke the Silence. On February 2nd, 2009, Christine Ross took her dog for a walk across the quiet, undeveloped land just beyond her neighborhood in West Mesa. The area was slated for new housing developments, just another patch of desert awaiting progress. But something in the dirt caught her dog's attention. A bone. Human, she suspected. She took a photo and sent it to her sister, a nurse. The response chilled her. "That's not animal." Christine called the police. Within hours, detectives were on site, digging. And what they found was more than a bone, it was a grave. And then another, and another. By the end of the investigation, 11 sets of female remains and 1 fetus had been unearthed. It was no accident, no coincidence. It was a serial killer's dumping ground. The scene that unfolded over the next few days shook the entire region. Police cordoned off the site. News helicopters hovered above. Reporters rushed to the scene. What was initially seen as a single tragedy became a macabre puzzle with no clear edges. The excavation site expanded quickly. Cadaver dogs swept the area. The soil became a crime scene of unimaginable scale. Forensics teams worked in sweltering conditions, unearthing layer after layer of horror. The dry climate had preserved many of the remains, allowing investigators to recover crucial evidence. But with every bone came another question, and with each grave, the realization that this was the work of a monster who had walked among them. Chapter 2: The Women Who Vanished. Between 2003 and 2005, several women disappeared from Albuquerque without a trace. Most of them had ties to sex work, or were known to struggle with drug addiction. Their disappearances were not treated as a series of connected events. Instead, they were written off as unfortunate casualties of their lifestyle. Many of the missing women were marginalized by society, living on the fringes where their disappearances did not make headlines. Law enforcement, distracted by other priorities, often failed to connect the dots. Friends and family knew something was wrong, but could do little to draw attention to their loved ones' cases. No one paid attention to the common thread linking the disappearances. That was, until Christine Ross's dog found a bone in the desert. The victims' families, however, never gave up hope. They held on to the belief that their loved ones were still alive, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Some sought help from private investigators, while others worked tirelessly to raise awareness. Yet the story of these women remained largely invisible, lost to a system that didn't care to look closer. Their lives had been reduced to statistics, and their deaths were forgotten too quickly. The discovery of the bodies at West Mesa would be the only chance for justice, but it came too late for those who were lost in the shadows. Chapter 3: The search begins. Once Christine Ross's discovery became public, the search for the killer began in earnest. But where to start? There were no clear suspects, and the years of murders were scattered like grains of sand across time. Detectives combed through police records of unsolved disappearances from the years before the discovery. They began piecing together a disturbing pattern. The women had all disappeared in the same general area, and their lives shared a tragic set of circumstances. Many had struggled with addiction, were working as prostitutes, or were involved in an underground world that left them vulnerable to predators. But there was no specific link that could tie the women together beyond this commonality. Investigation teams expanded their search across the city. They canvassed neighborhoods, interviewing family members, friends, and anyone who might have information. The task seemed impossible. These women had fallen through the cracks of a system that had long been indifferent to their struggles. Despite the challenges, authorities remained resolute in finding answers. As detectives delved deeper into the lives of the missing women, they uncovered chilling details about the manner in which their remains were buried. The discovery was a stark reminder of the lengths to which A would go to cover their tracks. Chapter 4: Uncovering the Truth. Forensic teams worked tirelessly on the remains recovered from the desert, trying to identify the victims. DNA testing was crucial in connecting the bones to missing persons, but this process took months. As the body count increased, the chilling reality of the situation settled in. This was not a single crime, but the work of a serial killer. The bodies had been buried in such a way that the killer appeared to have a systematic approach to disposing of the women, covering each grave meticulously, as though trying to erase any evidence of his crimes. Forensic investigators uncovered that the women had been dead for a long time before their remains were found. This fact led them to believe that the killer had been active for several years, possibly since the early 2000s. The remains revealed more details, such as traces of duct tape, and some had been bound. Forensic experts also found signs that the women had been transported to the burial site. These pieces of evidence pointed to a killer who had not acted in a moment of rage, but one who had been planning his crimes with cold precision. As more remains were uncovered, it became clear that there were many questions left to answer, and the investigation took a darker turn. How many victims had there been? How many more were still out there, waiting to be found? Chapter 5: The Desert of Forgotten Lives. The West Mesa Desert was not just a barren wasteland. To many in Albuquerque, it was a place to escape, a quiet corner where they could retreat from the noise of everyday life. But for the families of the missing women, the desert became a haunting reminder of lost hopes. For years, the area had been overlooked, with few people taking notice of the tragedy that was unfolding in its isolation. There were whispers of a killer who preyed on vulnerable women, but they were drowned out by the noise of the city's daily struggles. As police worked to piece together the victims' identities, the community began to recognize the disturbing truth. The West Mesa had become a graveyard, hidden in plain sight. The community was shocked, but not surprised. Those who knew the missing women had long suspected something terrible had happened to them. However, the cases remained unsolved, buried under bureaucratic delays, social stigmas, and systemic failures. The desert, silent and oppressive, had swallowed the truth. But now, the whispers had become a scream for justice. Chapter 6: The Search for the Killer. With each new discovery, the search for the killer intensified. Detectives scoured records of known sex offenders and possible suspects in the area. They also reviewed the behavior of people who had lived in the region at the time of the murders. It was clear that the killer had some knowledge of the desert landscape. The burial sites were located deep in areas that only locals would have known about. That meant the killer was likely familiar with the area and had been comfortable operating in the shadows. Yet the investigation was slow, and despite all the new evidence, the killer's identity remained elusive. The search was made even more complicated by the fact that many of the women had lived on the fringes of society. Law enforcement struggled to locate credible witnesses or people who might have seen something suspicious. Still, the investigation team pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. As the search continued, more attention was drawn to the unsolved cases of other women who had disappeared under similar circumstances in Albuquerque. But with each new lead, the answers seemed to grow more distant. Chapter 7: The Community's Response. As word of the West Mesa discovery spread, the Albuquerque community rallied behind the families of the victims. Advocacy groups, local activists, and concerned citizens took action. They demanded accountability from law enforcement and pushed for more resources to solve the case. Families of the missing women began to speak out, refusing to let their loved ones be forgotten. This public outcry forced authorities to take a hard look at the investigation and the way the missing women had been treated. While the media focused on the gruesome details of the case, it was the families and the community who continued to bring attention to the social issues at the heart of this tragedy. They highlighted the intersection of poverty, addiction, and sex work as the driving factors behind the women's vulnerability. It became clear that the women were more than just victims. They were individuals whose lives were worthy of dignity and respect. The community's response marked a turning point, pushing the investigation into the spotlight and ensuring that the story of the West Mesa Bone Collector would never be forgotten. Chapter 8: The Investigation Stalls. Despite the outpouring of support from the community, the investigation into the West Mesa Bone Collector case began to stall. As the years passed, the trail grew cold. No new leads emerged, and the case seemed to slip further into the abyss of unsolved mysteries. The killer had disappeared, and law enforcement struggled to keep momentum going. With each passing year, the families of the victims grew increasingly frustrated. The hope for justice seemed to diminish, as time and lack of answers eroded the confidence that the case would ever be solved. The media attention waned, and the case became just another tragic story in the long list of unsolved mysteries. But the pain for the families never faded. They continued to fight for justice, refusing to let their loved ones be forgotten. As the case stagnated, questions lingered. Could the killer still be living in Albuquerque? Had he moved on to other areas? Or was he, perhaps, a ghost from the past, lurking just out of sight? Chapter 9: The Role of Forensic Evidence. The key to solving the case of the West Mesa Bone Collector lay in the forensic evidence recovered from the victims' remains. DNA testing played a crucial role in identifying the women, but it was the smallest details that proved to be the most telling. Traces of hair, fibers, and other materials recovered from the crime scene provided valuable clues about the killer's methods. The remains themselves, preserved by the dry desert conditions, held secrets that could not be ignored. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to match DNA samples to known databases of criminal offenders, but the killer's identity remained a mystery. Still, each piece of evidence pointed to the possibility that the killer had a pattern, a signature that could be deciphered with enough time. The forensic evidence became the cornerstone of the investigation, but it also raised questions about what more could have been done to solve the case in the early years before the bodies were discovered. Chapter 10: Unanswered Questions. As the investigation continued, the questions surrounding the West Mesa Bone Collector case only seemed to multiply. Who was the killer? Why had they targeted these women? What was the motive behind the murders? Was there any connection between the victims, or was each death the work of a different individual? While the answers remained elusive, one thing was certain: the killer had left a trail that could eventually lead to justice. The victims' stories were not over, and their families would continue to fight for the truth, no matter how long it took. The investigation into the West Mesa Bone Collector case remains open, but the lack of leads and suspects leaves the story hanging in the air. The desert still holds its secrets, and the killer may still be out there, waiting for the world to forget. But as long as the families and the community keep searching for answers, the legacy of these women will never be buried. Their names will live on, and their stories will continue to be told until justice is served. Chapter 11: New Leads, New Hope. In 2019, the case of the West Mesa Bone Collector received a renewed sense of urgency. New leads surfaced, though they were still far from conclusive. Investigators began receiving tips from the public, some credible, others more speculative. But even the smallest clue provided a flicker of hope that the killer might soon be identified. Detectives returned to old suspects and re-examined potential connections between the missing women and other unsolved cases across the southwestern United States. They worked to piece together how each woman's life and death had intersected. Advances in facial recognition technology provided new tools to explore possible links to other crimes in the region. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle were being fit together, though no definitive answers were found. The families of the victims, although exhausted by years of uncertainty, were determined to press on. With each new lead, they found renewed strength. As time passed, the case gained traction once again, with new media outlets revisiting the story and producing in-depth documentaries, shining light on a tragedy that had been buried beneath the sand for far too long. Chapter 12: A Final Search for Justice. As of today, the West Mesa Bone Collector case remains open. Detectives continue to follow new leads and re-examine evidence, hoping for a breakthrough. The killer may still be out there, living quietly in a city that has long since forgotten the horrors buried in the desert. For the families of the victims, the search for justice remains a burning desire. Though years have passed since the remains were first discovered, the pain of losing loved ones in such a senseless and brutal manner has not faded. They continue to push for justice to keep the memories of their daughters, sisters, and mothers alive. The West Mesa Bone Collector case is not just about a killer. It's about the women whose lives were cut short, whose stories were erased before they could be fully told. As long as the case remains open, the hope for justice remains alive. And though the desert may remain silent, the memories of those lost will never fade. Thank you for watching. If you found this story fascinating and want to learn more about other true crime cases, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, stay vigilant and keep questioning the narratives that shape our world.